This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Michael Findlay about his new book, Portrait of the Art Dealer as a Young Man, New York in the 60s. In this generously illustrated memoir, Findlay traces his journey from his childhood home in Scotland to his influential career in New York, where he directed one of the first art galleries in SoHo. We discuss his experiences launching solo exhibitions for artists like Baldessari and Wilke, his relationships with iconic figures such as Andy Warhol and Johnston, and his vivid recollections of the vibrant New York art scene of the 60s and 70s. And now, an insider's perspective of the 60s New York art scene with Michael Findlay. Thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Michael, I just completed reading your new book, Portrait of the Art Dealer as a Young Man, New York in the 60s. It was, as I just mentioned to you, a page turner. Just an invigorating read. And I guess for those who are coming to the book without any knowledge of who you are or what your life was like in the 60s, where do you start to describe to them this chapter in your life that you've put down on page for them?
Although I would shy away from earmarking it as such, it is to a degree a coming of age in the art world, but it was a coming of age in a very, very, very different art world. And the reason I wanted to describe it actually is because a lot of young people come to me now and they say, well, how do I get started? How did you get started? And I said, well, I got started in a different century, in a different way, and that is not possible now. And I wanted to describe the world that I found at that time, which I thought to be, well, it was hospitable, it was collegial, it was inviting, it was exciting. It was also not glamorous. It was not based on money. It was not based on almost everything that seems to be running the art world, or as it is now called, the art market today. And I also wanted to tell a story of a young man who didn't really have a plan at all. I had no plan. And my plan was only solidified an hour after I arrived in New York and walked to Times Square. And after a year in Canada, and I have great respect for Canadians, I have Canadian family, but after a year in Toronto, I thought, oh my God, I'm home. And I didn't know anybody. I had no friend, didn't know anybody. But I felt somehow, this is February of 1964, I felt very comfortable. But I was also very naive. I was fearless out of naivete. I had $200 and a ticket home back to the UK, which I soon cashed in because I wanted to stay here. And my first ambition, in order to be able to stay here, was to get a job in a bookstore. That's what I really wanted. I didn't really have that much experience with art galleries. I had with art museums. I'd visited a lot. I didn't really know anything about art galleries. I was a poet, wannabe poet, and there were particular bookstores. I was devastated when I couldn't just walk in and get a job. So I had met a young lady, as one does at that age in New York at that time, and she said, "Oh, Michael, you could get a job in an art gallery. You could just sit at the door and smile at people when they come in." And I thought, that's an extremely good idea. And I envisaged myself at a very nice desk. I hadn't yet been in an art gallery, so I was making this up in my head, and I'd have my Olivetti on my desk and I'd be writing, the great American poem or the great Canadian or the great Scottish poem and smiling at charming people when they came in. So So I ventured across Central Park. I was living on 88th in Amsterdam, and I walked through the park and I came out north of the Metropolitan,
Mm-hmm.
and I walked down 81st Street. This was the first time I'd ever been on the Upper East Side. I'd been in New York about 2 or 3 months, and I walked towards Madison. And before I got to Madison, I saw a sign that said Richard Feigen Gallery on a townhouse. And I walked up the steps, and I walked up a rather grand staircase to the second floor, and I poked my head in, and I said, more or less, I'm looking for a job. So a young lady who I got to know very, very well, wonderful woman, she became a scholar of the work of Joseph Cornell, actually. She said, oh, well, Mr. Feigen isn't here tomorrow, but we might. He's not here today. Can you come back tomorrow? So I said, well, of course I could. But as I left, I thought there's no way I need to do that, because I'm certainly going to get a job in the next gallery. If it's that easy. Well, it wasn't, of course, because I walked down Madison Avenue, and every gallery that I went into, the person at the desk was the job that I wanted. So I went back the next day. Anyway, I went back the next day. I got a job. I was paid $50 cash. I didn't have a green card at that time. And I became unwittingly an apprentice. And I learned by doing and by being around. In those days, most galleries were small in the sense that there was an owner. They usually had a sidekick, a secretary, if you'll excuse the word now, I wouldn't use it now, and an art handler. And that was it. Even galleries like Leo Castelli that might have handled quite a lot of important artists. That was it.
You started by describing the art world at that time as being a different generation in terms of dollars. And, it's really interesting as your story unfolds. I'm sitting there reading it, wondering, when are you going to start earning a commission? When's Richard going to start sharing the pie a little bit more with you? And it seemed like you kept on getting more responsibilities, but income was never really... It wasn't like your bank account was overflowing, right? That was for the owner. I mean, it was kind of a separation there, right?
It's really hard to grasp the fact that nobody's bank accounts were overflowing, and that really wasn't a goal. I think even very few successful galleries handling contemporary artists were running on profit. Feigen fueled his stipends for his contemporary artists by selling Monets and Gorky drawings and Clifford Still paintings. Some galleries were owned and run by people who had what we might call private money. They could lose a bit, or at least they didn't have to make money. I mean, Sidney Janis, for instance, had made a fortune by designing a two-pocket short-sleeve shirt, and that left him with enough money to build a great collection and run a gallery. So I had, in retrospect, first of all, I was living most of the time in a building that Richard Feigen owned, and I was living above the shop. When the gallery moved down to Green Street, I was on Green Street there. I lived on the third floor, and the gallery was so I wasn't paying any rent. If I covered my bill at Max's, that was probably my goal. I didn't think about saving money, just having enough. I didn't have a car. You didn't need a car in those days. Money wasn't the goal. It's difficult to understand that, because everything now in the art world is totally monetized. There is nothing that doesn't need to have a profit reason for it, which is why we are where we are today.
No, it's very interesting, and it's such a contrast. When you enter that world of the Richard Feigen Gallery, you're kind of thrust into a world of mid 60s artists that it's a different world, right? I mean, and it's a subculture that we really love reading and learning more about these days, in a world that was a bit of a curiosity in its time.
That's a very, very interesting point. I'm not sure that it was. To the general public and the world at large, it was mostly unknown. An example of that is that Time Life magazine employed a woman named Rosalind Constable, who was a very, very smart woman. And almost her entire job was to basically scour the New York underground for interesting stories that could be turned into articles for Life magazine, like Roy Lichtenstein, is he the worst painter in America? Or, or a big spread about something that Christo had just done with 5 pages of great photographs in Life magazine. So there were people who were trying to translate this world, but it wasn't glamorous. It didn't think of itself as glamorous. Artists and collectors, let alone dealers or museum people, were not bold-faced names. They didn't get mentioned in gossip columns. I mean, they might have got mentioned in rather scurrilous underground magazines or whatever, but not. It was its own thing. It didn't think of itself as, well, artists took what they did seriously. There was a seriousness about it, but it didn't really connect very much with the world at large to the degree that we now see. There's a perfect marriage between the entertainment world and the art world now. So you read about Jeff Koons as having hamburgers with Jeff Bezos in a particular restaurant, and that's news. There would have been it would have been ludicrous to have even conceived of it being interesting that this artist had a meal with that collector. And in fact, in Soho, there weren't any restaurants anyway. So
in the second chapter, you open it up by creating this scene at a restaurant post-opening of just what's a real cavalcade of 60s pop and Abex, what would be postmodern artists. We're talking about Jasper Johns, Rauschenberg, Lichtenstein, Marisol, Warhol. What was it like to kind of find yourself in the middle of that crowd? I mean, you probably recognize some of the, even if it wasn't popular culture in, say, People magazine, within the insulated art world, these were names that were on the cutting edge in that time.
Oh, yeah, they were, but also there were a lot of names that you didn't mention because nobody knows now who they were, but almost everybody was seated on the same level in those days. I knew who Andy Warhol was when he sat down next to me, right? But I remember distinctly at the opening that party followed, I had come late to the gallery and there was a room full of people, and somebody had said to me, Roy Lichtenstein's in there, right? He was already pretty well known. So I went up to this guy who I assumed was Roy Lichtenstein because he had flowing black hair and he was wearing a long black leather coat. And I started talking to him, and this woman pushed him aside and said, "Don't talk to my husband, Christo. He doesn't speak English. You have to talk to me. I'm the boss." And so not only had I mistaken Christo for Roy Lichtenstein, but I wasn't supposed to talk to him because his wife didn't want me to try to, make any deals. So that was the kind of thing that would happen. I didn't conjure that up out of my imagination. There was a very specific meal. And in those days, galleries adjacent to each other, especially in the area where I still am, and I'm talking from the Upper East Side, tended to have their openings on Tuesday evenings. They coordinated their openings. There was a French liqueur company called Ricard, and Ricard would give free booze to galleries so long as you put their big distinctive yellow ashtrays out, because everybody smoked, everybody drank. So many times you would find artists who knew each other had openings on the same night. Now, the people who came to the openings, by and large, were not collectors. You tried to get them in while you were hanging the show a couple of days before. They were the artists, their friends, their hangers-on, maybe some writers. People like yourself would be there. And afterwards, their word would go around about a particular place, a Greek restaurant often, or a Chinese restaurant downtown, where everybody paid for themselves, and you just end up there. Everybody would go, and you might have people from 2 or 3 different openings. I could be seated next to a charming young lady who later I might have some relationship with, or a well-known artist, or an artist who was a friend who wasn't that well-known. But it was, collegial is the only word I can think of that's really appropriate. It wasn't competitive from a career point of view. There were certainly artists in Gallery A who would like to be in Gallery B. But when we look back on that kind of history, we just see the buildings that have grown the tallest.
Right.
But in those days, it was a much flatter horizon. And there were some very successful artists, Ernst Trover, Lowell Nesbitt, who we knew were actually making a lot of money. Ernst Trover had Pace Gallery, and they couldn't stop selling his work. But he doesn't seem to have survived historically in the way that some other artists have.
Are there specific names from that era that you think will wind up being rediscovered? I mean, for example, mentioned Marisol. Just this month, there's a show going on at the AKG in Buffalo, which is a huge retrospective of Marisol work. That's just an example of someone from that specific time being rediscovered. Are there other names that deserve, or you hope might be brought back into the fold in terms of popularity and acclaim?
Marisol is a very interesting example, because I was very surprised to read that Marisol was rediscovered, because I didn't think she had ever gone away. So there is an element, and I don't mean to be snide about this, by many people now whose rediscovery of an artist is actually their ignorance. It has to do with their ignorance. It doesn't have to do. Marisol, I've sold 1 or 2 very major pieces by Marisol within the last 10, 15 years to museums. If you go to the Ludwig Museum in Cologne, you will probably always find a crowd of people around the Marisols. But Marisol's output, the nature of her work, was not such that Christie's or Sotheby's can boast that they sold a Marisol for $50 million.
Right.
Which seems to be the criteria for an artist not going away. So there are a number of artists, I think, whose rediscovery is amusing, because I think their historical place is pretty assured. There are others, however, who I think thought at the time, and still think are very good, who, like, there's a painter called Bob Stanley. Bob Stanley was actually Roy Lichtenstein's brother-in-law. His wife was Dorothy, the recently sadly departed Dorothy Lichtenstein's sister. And Bob Stanley was you could say, a contender as a pop artist in the day. He did paintings, major paintings of Mick Jagger. He did paintings which were fairly pornographic. He had exhibitions. Terribly nice guy. I know a few people that now have a lot of his paintings, but he's not on the radar. He fell off. He never got completely on the radar, In other words, he would have been included. If there was a pop show in 1970s of like 50 artists, he would have been one of them. But if there's a pop show of 20 artists, he wouldn't be. So I'd love to find a good painting of his reasonable enough that I would buy it now because I like it. But I don't know if there are good artists who will not make it into the canon, whatever the future canon is going to be. But there's also a need now to rediscover artists because of their identity. There is a belief that they were overlooked, true or false. And therefore they're being resurrected, not necessarily entirely because of their work, but because of their identity.
Well, let me throw another name at you. Earlier this year, I had the privilege to sit down like we are right now with Francis Beatty and talk about Ray Johnston. And when I was last in New York, I spent an entire afternoon up at the Ray Johnston estate in what used to be Richard's Gallery. Just such a captivating character. And Michael, you were on the front line in trying to wrangle Ray Johnston, and you were one of those handfuls that were showing up at the correspondence school events, right? I mean, you were right there in the thick of it with Ray.
Yeah, I was one of the original. Well, I was one of the few attendees of the first meeting about the meeting of the first meeting, the correspondence school. So yes,
that's so Ray.
I get along with Ray very well. I mean, I kind of connected with him at that brief period in his career where he was willing to have exhibitions. So he'd had shown at the Willard Gallery, and he liked Richard Feigen, as opposed to his mail art, which was chaotic and free. His, what he called his gallery art, his collages, which had to be very specifically framed. I enjoyed a relationship with him. I installed all of his exhibitions at Feigen, and I guess I became part of the group of people, and a very, very disparate group, who were part of the correspondence school, spelled DANCE, because it was a dance. There were people who didn't know they were members, you know. There were people who had the same name as George Siegel, the sculptor, and George Siegel, the artist. They might be George Siegel in Winnetka, Illinois, but they became members because their name was George Siegel. He was a very special character, and it's very strange to me that in death, his career is flourishing. And I think it's because he's not there to prevent that. Because I think during his lifetime, he actually almost actively prevented that in a strange way.
Yeah, and there was something that Francis had all these stories to tell about how it's almost like he would go out of his way to try to self-sabotage. And I don't know if it was self-sabotage intentionally or if he had just enjoyed the game of making the person on the other end of the transaction awkward.
If it had commercial ramifications, he liked to push back. You know, and you know, the famous story about I won't go into it at length, but the collector himself told it for many years, where he was negotiating over the price of something, and he then directly with Ray, not through the gallery, and he said, "Well, I'll pay you 20%." So Ray sent him the collage with 20% of it cut off. Yeah, I'll give you 20% off, but you'll get 20% less of an artwork. I mean, he had these principles, and I think they were actually very sound. But he was not flexible. He wasn't playing the art game, but he was also one of those people who, I mean, it's often said of artists, but in this case, it's true. And this wasn't, you could say his life was a conceptual artwork, but the fact is, everything he did, Marion Willard gave him a cocktail party before I'd met him, and she had a very, very fancy apartment with a white carpet, and she had a cocktail party. She obviously didn't know him very well, and he arrived half an hour late, carrying a sink that he'd found somebody had left, to be picked up by the garbage people on the Upper East Side. It was a whole sink, right? And he staggered up the stairs. He walked in and he put it down in the middle of the room and left. And that's kind of career destroying. I mean, that's perhaps on a level with the alleged story of Jackson Pollock peeing in a fireplace. But
So tell me about Max's of Kansas City. Because that seems like that was the real watering hole. And if you weren't an artist, if you weren't on the inside, maybe you need not even try to show up.
I had to try and turn that inside out. There weren't that many people who knew about it, who weren't welcome. But when a few wealthy people found out about it and they wanted to be there because they thought it had become someplace, they were not welcome by design. But the inhabitants, I mean, the reason a lot of us was there, the food was atrocious, right? But for a lot of artists, it was free because Mickey Ruskin was an unbelievably generous man. He's a wonderful man. And if he bought a work from an artist, what they got basically was an endless tab at Max's. It never ran out. I mean, he could have bought something that the gallery might have sold for $3,000 or $4,000, But in the course of, 5 years, they ate a lot more than that or drank a lot more than that. And he didn't do that as a business device, really. I think there were probably two distinctly different eras of Max's. I'm describing in the book its birth and early years as almost exclusively a place for artists. And then when he opened up the upstairs and started to have bands, then it became much more of a rock and roll place. And I think that second era of Max's was one where it became famous. It wasn't famous at the time. It was an artist hangout. And artist hangout there'd been a place in the Lower East Side called Stanley's, and that's where Mickey Ruskin had started. And then there was a place called the Ninth Circle, which had big barrels of peanuts. And somebody told me recently, I know the Ninth Circle. That was a gay bar. If it was, most of us were unaware of that. I don't know. I mean, it could have been or whatever. It didn't matter anyway. Nobody cared. So, and then he opened Max's on 17th Street and Central Park South Park Avenue South, because I'm sure the rent was much less expensive. And in that neighborhood, it wasn't on the mafia's radar, so he didn't have to pay them off. If you were in the Village, you'd have to. If you were anywhere else,
there is a small part in a chapter about turning down an offer that would have been too good to refuse, right?
Well, that was for the Stonewall. We wanted, a group of us, three friends and I wanted to rent the Stonewall and turn it into a club. And we had very elaborate ideas for that. And we finally found out that we were finally approached by the owner of the Stonewall, and the owner of the Stonewall was willing to give it to us for a very reasonable rent, but we would have to buy all our liquor from the owner of the Stonewall, who made it clear that he did not have a liquor license. We would have to be he needed us to get a liquor license. And so it was exactly the same pattern that we later found out. We spoke to the owner of, I think, the Village Gate on 8th Street. No, it was a coffee house, a guy who didn't serve alcohol. And he said everybody in the Village guess their liquor from these people, and they own you. Once you do that, then they own you. And we were not prepared to do that. We were scared.
You wind up in Soho, and you're kind of a first mover. How did you see that you could open an art space in Soho? Is it because the artists were already there?
Yes, the artists were already there. Some of them had legal lofts, some of them had illegal lofts. Dick Feigen had bought these 2 buildings. I didn't think when he bought them, he really made the connection, because I started taking collectors down to artist studios in Soho, Feigen then realized we could use one of the buildings he bought as storage. So our artists, Richard Smith, British painter, Charles Hinman, American, they were doing huge shaped canvases. And so, you want to get them out of the studio. You want to show them to collectors. There were a small number of collectors who loved to go down to Soho because they thought it was, groovy, and they were in at the beginning. But, every time a visit of one collector to an artist studio blows the whole day for the artist, and they might not buy anything. So I started taking these large paintings, painting the walls, the brick walls white, and sticking them on the walls at 141 Green Street. This is 66, 67. And people started to come down, and I would take people down. And Feigen's idea also was actually to rent half of that space to Leo Castelli, but he didn't. Ivan Kopp told Leo it was better to go way up on Amsterdam Avenue. There's something strange happened about that time. Anyway, so what evolved was we suddenly had a space on the street and a second floor. I don't know where the idea came from to actually have a formal exhibition. I do know that one of the driving forces was Paula Cooper, because Paula Cooper she'd been the director of Park Place Gallery, which was just north of Houston Street. And then she moved down and she opened Paula Cooper Gallery. I think she called it Paula Cooper Gallery, the same month that I had the first exhibition at Feigen downtown. And that was October of 1968. And there were three other dealers, Stephen Radish, Max Davidson, maybe David Whitney, who also had exhibitions in that so-called first season. But it was because the artists were there. Most collectors living on the Upper East Side, it took them years to get down there because it's like going to another country. They were frightened, and they wouldn't know. There was nowhere to eat and nowhere to park their limousines because the trucks were taking up all the space on the, yeah.
You have a really colorful chapter in the book about the folks in Fort Worth that, it kind of came I wouldn't say a home away from home, but it sounds like you were certainly welcomed as family by the eccentric oil class of Fort Worth. Can you kind of talk about how that came about?
There was an extraordinary museum director called Henry Hopkins, and Henry Hopkins would have been in his 50s at that time, and he was the director of what was then called the Fort Worth Art Center. And I don't know where his vision came from, but he had it. And he gathered a group of young Turks, young Fort Worth people, some of them subsequently very well known, like Sid and Ann Bass, but they were all friends of each other. And they were his, I guess, young collectors club. I mean, there was no name for it. And the first I knew about it was when I think probably 1969, the first year I had exhibitions in Soho. Henry called me out of the blue, and he introduces himself and he says, "I'm coming to New York with a group of collectors. can we bring them to the gallery? And I said, yeah, well, yes, of course you can, right? So there were at least 3 couples. Jim Mika, who didn't have a date or wasn't married, they came down and they were like really, really nice and really, really interested to show you what they right. They visited with me for about a couple of hours. And then they said, well, come and have dinner with us tonight. And I said, sure. Where? They said, the Knickerbocker Club. So I'm going from 141 Green Street in my whatever I'm wearing, to the Knickerbocker Club, where if you bring papers out, a waiter comes over and slaps a wooden tray on your head, the waspiest place in town. And we just got along. And Jim Mika, who is kind of slightly older than the others, the leader of the pack, he just said, you got to come down, spend the weekend. I'll sell some paintings for you. And he did. And they were connected also through friendships with a West Coast crowd, because the West Coast crowd of artists were not very welcome. New York kind of looked down on people like Ed Ruscha and Larry Bell and Jim Ganza. They were like dudes. They weren't so serious, But the Texans loved them, and they loved the Texans. So they spent time in Texas too. So that there was a connection to New Mexico also. It had nothing to do with investment. It had absolutely nothing to do with what something was going to be worth tomorrow. It had to do with having a good time, always having a roadie when you drove from one party to another, which is a big styrofoam cup full of booze, right? And you had a clip on the front of your car to hold that, right? I didn't see any guns when I was down there, but a lot of booze and a lot of weed, a lot of good times.
No, you tell this hilarious story about showing up and your host gave you a roadie and the keys to a Cadillac to go pick up someone, and you were trying to explain that you didn't drive. And like, well, it's a Cadillac. It drives itself. Just go pick her up.
It actually, I got it onto Camp Bowie Boulevard, and then it stopped. But it stopped because it was out of gas. And then when I went to pick up my date, who I'd never met before, and she came to the door, she was very attractive, very, very nice. She came to a very big door. She lived in a very big house, and she was very stoned when she opened the door. So she wasn't going to drive the car back. So anyway, that was my introduction to the Fort Worth crowd in those days.
You mentioned the West Coast crowd, the Ed Ruschas, the Larry Bells. In the book, you tell the story about another West Coaster that walked into your gallery one day with the slides under his arm. Can you kind of share the story of how you met John Baldessari?
Well, yes, I didn't connect him with the guys you've mentioned already. They're established. They're kind of, they're established. You can buy, Ed Ruscha was selling his gunpowder drawings for $1,200 a piece, but there were a lot of galleries carrying them. So, people knew who Ed was. I was in the gallery. The normal way that artists brought themselves to the attention of a gallery was to bring their slides on a Monday or Tuesday. Usually on a Tuesday, their slides, 35 millimeter slides, leave them and come back the next week. And you'd either say, yeah, I'll come to your studio, or I'm not interested. And that was pretty much a known system. Anyway, it must have been a boring day. This tall guy with a beard walks in, and he's holding, instead of a small box of 35 millimeter slides, he's got a big Kodak, yellow Kodak box of photographs. And I don't know, I was in the office in the back. Somebody must have come and said, there's this man, he wants to show you his work. And I looked out, and he's a tall guy, and he has a genial aspect to him, right? So I thought, what the heck, Look, if they're terrible, I knew by then how to say the right things. I would never say to an artist, "This is trash, take it away." But so he comes in and he's standing there. I asked him to sit down because he's towering over me. I'm sitting, and he hands me this box of photographs. I open it up, and they're black and white photographs of his word paintings that I think most people know what they look like now. They're actually made by a sign painter. He didn't paint them, right? But they're his paintings. So immediately you've got something that's kind of really amusing to me. Anyway, I take them out and I start reading them, and I just start laughing my head off. I mean, they're hilarious. And he's laughing too, so it's okay. I'm not insulting him by laughing. And I just thought they hit, because I guess I still, I was practicing as a poet, a concrete poet, words, shapes. And I'd done an exhibition called Words, so I'm the perfect person, whether he knew it or not, the mark for this kind of work. And we never discussed it, actually. I mean, we never discussed what it meant because you didn't need to. I put him in the first group show that I had in October 1968 in Soho. And then I gave him a show later where he did paintings, where he had commissioned Sunday painters to do realistic paintings, and then he put their name underneath, again with a sign painter. So what was so interesting to me about Baldessari in New York in 1968 and 1969 is that the New York art world absolutely couldn't take it. Was he making fun of conceptual art? Was he making fun of the super realists who were around the corner at Louis Mizell, who was selling them at a fair clip at good prices? He wasn't dressed in black like Joseph Kossuth. Well, the one person who got it at that time who counted was a cologne dealer called Conrad Fisher, who had actually been an artist, and he was the same generation actually as Beuys and Penck, I think. Anyway, and he was starting a gallery in Cologne. He saw the show in my gallery, and John much later told me that was actually how his career got off the ground. I didn't sell anything. I couldn't. Nobody bought. They were $1,200. I couldn't sell them.
The book is wonderful. It's an intermittent sort of dance between stories like the one you just told and stories about dalliances in, kind of stumbling into modeling gigs, or next thing you know, you are dating a model you're in a shoot with that you never anticipated, whether it's Carly Simon or, whoever. It's just as many stories are about these relationships. It was a really colorful time to be in New York and single and meeting people, right? Especially if you had a non-American accent.
I have to say that there were certain things that I had going for me that I was probably blissfully unaware of. But Brits weren't actually there. Brits were not. I found out, and I was surprised about this. There were Brits in New York who were not very popular, particularly if they had gone to good schools, as I had, and had what we now call a posh accent, which I probably had quite a bit of at that time. Because the Upper East Side of New York was speckled with young men who were being paid to stay away from their families in England because they were reprobates, or they were their families had money, or they were sent to their American cousins, or they were sent to I don't want to make up a job, but to kind of hang out. And so they had a reputation for being sponges, actually. I had no one to sponge off because I didn't know anybody. So I had to earn my living from the get-go. It was easy to meet people. I don't know how else to say it. People were friendly. I mean, all kinds of people, beatniks, punks, and the well-to-do.
I guess you chose the right career because meeting people, making relationships, it was a huge part of what made your career flow, right? I mean, the ability to call up someone and ask them not only if they're interested, do you know someone who's interested, or it's all about having a network, right?
If I'd only known the word. Yeah. No, I'm serious. That's what I tell young people now. It's really, really important. If they do get a job in a gallery or an auction house, they should really actually make an effort to meet their peers across the board in other galleries, other auction houses, go out, meet people, go to parties, etc., because that becomes actually your currency. I didn't realize that I had it, but at a certain point I probably did. I had Joe Hirshhorn's phone number. I'm 23 years old, for God's sake. He's not yet got the museum, but he's a big collector. But it was a small world, so people didn't say, no, you've got to speak to my advisor, because they didn't have any, there weren't any advisors. They actually, this is the difference. Collectors actually walked into galleries on their own feet. Their feet touched the ground, and they brought their families with them. And they looked around and they talked about paintings, and they asked me questions, and they didn't always buy something. They didn't go with the purpose, I am going to see this painting to see if I want it. They'd say, have you got anything for me, Michael? Got something for me to see? And that's the way people did it.
You eventually leave the nest of Richard Feigen and strike out on your own on Spring Street. Can you talk a little bit about kind of that leap of faith in what it took to kind of make that work?
Again, I think naivety had a lot to do with it. Also, I was familiar enough with SoHo that I knew my costs would be very low. I knew how to do this. A lot of the impetus came actually from this one, I almost call him pseudo client I had, called John Cagle, who needed a love nest for his extramarital affair. And I knew of this building on the corner of Spring and West Broadway, 157 Spring Street, which was up for sale from the city because the unpaid taxes were $40,000. And so he bought the building for $40,000. It was a substantial amount, but not a huge amount. And so I negotiated a very reasonable rent for the fifth floor and promised to find him tenants of other galleries for the other floors. And we had a art bookstore owner called Jaap Rietman who moved into the street level. So it was a perfect setup for a gallery building. I didn't have any capital. I didn't have any savings, but I borrowed I think $4,000 from a very generous collector, client of mine called Keith Barish, who wasn't much older than me, but he'd made a lot of money. He said, pay me back when you can. He wasn't charging me interest. People helped, a couple of artists. There were always artists / contractors, to hire to put in a floor or a ceiling. I paid them. They were probably a lot less expensive than, frankly, union people, even in those days. So it came together kind of easily. And there were other people. Betty Cunningham was doing the same thing with the gallery over Finelli's on nearby. And we could all manage on those kinds of budgets, selling every once in a while until it got towards the end of the 70s. And the real estate picture changed completely. The artists, followed by the galleries, had made SoHo fashionable, I guess. The trucks had moved away, the light manufacturing had moved out, and there were already people who were not artists and they were not dealers, who were trying to buy loft spaces and gussy them up, and so the values increased exponentially throughout the 70s. A lot of artists were also the victims of that. They couldn't afford their lofts anymore unless they bought them early.
Michael, nowadays when they create art history texts about this period, one of the works or events that is always mentioned is Joseph Beuys' I Like America and America Likes Me. And that takes place in that building where you've subleased Rene Bloch Gallery, and you actually received a telegram from Rene asking for assistance in pulling this piece off, right?
Well, it's interesting. I remember Beuys coming. I remember being downstairs. I was on 5, he was on 4, being downstairs, being involved in the piece, liking the piece. I had bought Beuys's work early on. Before he did that performance, he had come to New York to prepare for it, and Rene had taken him to meet me. It was all very nice. I had actually supplied the Coyote. It was, so I went, no, I found this literally a couple of years ago. I saw this and I thought, oh my God. So the Coyote there are, I think, certainly German scholars who have written lengthy texts about the Coyote. Its origins in the desert, its name, So I get this telegram from Rene saying, misspelling names, etc., but basically saying, I need a Coyote by Saturday or whatever. It was a week away, right? Well, in those days, we had the Yellow Pages. A big, thick book full of... So I found a guy in New Jersey who rented Coyotes, or maybe he only had one. And I don't remember his name, but I have the note with his telephone number on it. So I'm sure he's not there now, but I had the telephone number of the guy. I remember calling him. This wasn't a strange request, apparently. And I rented the Coyote for, I guess, Beuys and Rene Bloch. I think it was a 3-day event. It wasn't a week. I think it was a 3, at the most 4. And I think it was maybe $100 a day. And the Coyote was not a wild dog. I don't think you could have rented a wild dog, got hold of one, but it was a domesticated dog, very well behaved. Yeah, I'm happy to play a small role in that aspect of art history. What was amusing was that by the second day, Beuys and the dog, I don't think Beuys thought he was going to train the dog, but Beuys would do these things like wrap his gray blanket around himself with his kind of walking stick sticking out of the top and roll over on the floor, and the dog would do the same thing. So they became very much a pair. It was amusing, but I'm sorry to have upset all those art historians who've they could say maybe I'm not, maybe they will claim that I'm making this up, so that's fine too. I mean, one always wonders if what you remember is completely accurate, but the reason I feel this is accurate is that I'd completely forgotten it until I found the evidence in my files. Yeah.
Michael, your book, Portrait of the Art Dealer as a Young Man, New York in the 60s, but your story in the book takes us all the way to 1977. And I'm just curious, did it feel like there was a carryover of the 60s sensibility Was there something seminal? Like when you read Tom Sawyer, kind of ends on this boy has now gone through something that has turned him into a man. Was there something about 1977, that New Year's, the dawn of perhaps disco? Why is it that that's where the story, this chapter of your life ends?
I think there are two reasons. One, and I may be misremembering this, but I think there were discussions among peers of mine afterwards that the 60s ended in 77. I don't think I made that up. But specifically what happened in 1977 was the end of SoHo as a reasonably priced place to live. There was a movement in 1977, an anonymous movement that placed posters around SoHo saying, "SoHo sucks, bring back the trucks." I don't know who was responsible for that, but I'm sure it was an artist-driven expression of discontent with what had happened to in a space of a decade, to an area which was accommodating, hospitable, fun, creative, and it had become, not overnight, but in the course of that much of the decade, it had become catnip for yuppies who had enough money to pay $50,000 for a loft, that I was paying $1,200 or $1,500 a month rent for. And the people that bought the building that I was in actually wanted me to buy my space for $50,000, but actually it was worth at that time $25,000. I mean, I didn't have the money anyway. And that actually happened because you can see there are articles written in 77 about the demise of SoHo, and there's speculation as to what's going to replace it. Is it going to become Nolita, Northern Little Italy, or there are various. None of them stuck. It was before Tribeca was created, but none of these labels stuck. But there was definitely even journalists who were speculating about, where will SoHo go? Where will the next SoHo be? But there hasn't been a next SoHo because New York, Manhattan, unfortunately, is no longer accommodating young, poor, willing to be waiters, creative people who just want a space to make some art. So that's why it was 77 in a way.
Well, Michael, this has been a wonderful hour. Again, I'm not exaggerating when I say that I really enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
Such an easy read. I don't know if you're going to have a sequel someday that takes us beyond 1977, but I really appreciate your hospitality and sitting down with me for an hour. It's really been a joy.
It's been a pleasure for me, and thank you very, very much. It's an honor to be on this podcast, and I hope we meet in person.
Absolutely. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.